Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Theory Poems and Paintings. We're on day 124, and we're starting to talk today about verbal adjectives, right? Active verbal adjectives. So remember, when we say verbal adjectives, we mean adjectives that are derived from verbs, right? So we've got to learn how to do that. But we can already say that once we complete that process, what we'll be left with are adjectives, like any other adjective in Russian, meaning they're going to have the same endings, adjectival endings that we've already learned. They're going to modify a noun, and they're going to agree with the noun they modify in terms of gender, number, and case, right? So just as we might expect. And so in that sense, there's nothing special about these adjectives at all in terms of how we're using them grammatically. Again, beyond the fact of being derived from verbs. So a quick painting here. Stradная пора косы, right? It's a little hard to say that word there, косы. Anyway, what is a косец? What are these people doing? Здесь мы видим крестьян, работающих в поле, точнее, косящих пшеницу. Right here we see peasants working in a field, or more precisely, mowing wheat. Right, they're cutting down wheat, mowing wheat. Okay, so we see in the bullet, we see two verbal adjectives there. Работающих, from a verb we know well, работать. Right, so this means working. Right, what kind of peasants do we see? We see peasants working in the field. So that die verbal работающих is modifying крестьян in the accusative plural, right, which looks like genitive plural because these are animate, right, peasants. Or more precisely, they are mowing wheat, косящих. That's from a verb we probably don't know, косить, which means to mow, right? Косец – это тот, кто косит. А чем косить? Косой. Right, a косец is one who mows, right? A mower, I guess we could say, is one who mows. With what does he mow? Косой, right? With a sieve or skiv, right? Скосив всю пшеницу, они ее соберут и сделают из нее муку и хлеб. Okay, there's a form we already know, right? Skasiv, that's a verbal adverb. So having mown all the wheat, they will gather it, they'll collect it and make from it flour and bread. Okay, so again, look these over, compare, right? We had two verbal adjectives, and we can see that they're adjectives even without knowing much else about them. We see the ich, that adjectival ending. But with skasiv, which we've already talked about, we don't see any adjectival ending. That's an adverb, a verbal adverb, perfective verbal adverb, right? Having mown. Okay, if we give a quick overview of today's verbal adjectives, we have, we're talking only about active ones today. Okay, so next time we'll transition to passive verbal adjectives. Today we have active verbal adjectives which break down into present active and past active. Okay, so here are examples of all three of the verbal adjectives we're forming today. The first one, present active, and take a moment to guess what aspect we can form these from. Present active. Well, only imperfective, and that makes perfect sense since we're calling these present active. Remember, active as in the present tense, like present tense, right? They can only be we can only use imperfective verbs for present tense actions in Russian because if it's present tense, then it's ongoing, right? So present active adjectives similarly can only be formed from imperfective verbs, right? So we only have one of those. For example, студент, читающий книгу, a student who is reading a book. Now you can see already we're going to be, to be extra careful, we're usually going to translate these as who is, right? Verbal adjectives will translate as who or which clauses. Today it'll be mostly who, right? Who is doing something. And that just simply makes clear that these are adjectives that are we can trace back to a noun. Right, and again, that's also to help avoid this ambiguity with all these ing words in English that whose role in the sentence grammatically can be somewhat vague quite often. Okay, so студент, читающий книгу, a student who is reading. Now, for past actives, we can get those from either aspect, right? Which makes perfect sense, right? Imperfective or perfective. Студентка, читавшая книгу would be a female student in this case, who was reading a book, right? Imperfective. versus студенты, прочитавшие книгу, students who have read the book or had read the book perfectively, right? Meaning they've read it completely. Not that they were in the process of reading it, but they've completely read it. Okay, if we survey those endings, we see I, iya, right? We see that the endings have changed depending on the adverb is the adjective is modifying, right? First example has masculine, second has feminine, singular, and then the third one is plural, right? See how the adjectival endings are changing. Okay, one little way we could rephrase these that you may hear in speech, right? Instead of using one of these fancy verbal adjectives, and especially in a clause like this, we could simply use a who or which clause, literally in Russian, using который, as we recently reviewed. And we see that when we do that, we transition from a deverbal to just a simple form of a verb, a conjugated form of the verb. We see that we don't lose any information, right? In terms of aspect, tense, or anything, right? So look at студент, который читает, right? So a student who is reading. That lines up completely with the читающий, right? Which is present active, a present active verbal adjective. It's imperfective. Same thing with который читает. Now compare студентка, которая читала, right? A student who was reading. Look at that imperfective verb, which is past, active, right? Past tense, active voice, right? And читала from an imperfective verb. Now compare that with студенты, которые прочитали, right? Students who read completely, and we get past, active, perfective verb there in that example, right? So we can always rewrite these somewhat fancy clauses with the verbal adjective. We can rephrase those as который clauses. Okay, so let's look now at how to form these things. Let's start with the present actives. Now again, present suggests that indeed we can only form these from imperfective verbs, present active verbal adjectives. Okay, so we're going to start again with the third plural with these. For example, читают, строят, говорят, живут. And here we're going to get rid of the T only, the te, right? Not the whole ending, but just the te. And then we add she. And if we have to think about stress, that would normally, we should really look at the ya form, although often just in practice, the stress will flow right from the infinitive, or even, I guess, from the ani form, right, that our starting form. Okay, so stress usually isn't a very big deal, but again, with certain peculiar verbs, we may have to really look at that ya form to get the right stress. Okay, so we get читающий, строящий, говорящий, живущий. We could translate those as who or which, who is reading, who is building, who is talking, who is living. If we were talking about an object for whatever reason, that would be which is doing whatever. Okay, what about reflexive verbs? Well, they're going to end in shi, sia, right? And a little note here, we're always going to write sia, no matter what the ending of this form is. Now, this is, I think, the only exception to this rule we generally give, right? We say if a verb form happens to end in a vowel, we add simply soft s, right? If it ends in a consonant, we add sia. But for these verbal adjectives, we would always write sia. Okay, so let's look at the basic forms here, the masculine forms, right? From смеяться, again, we use the same system. We take the third plural, смеются, we drop the te, we add she, and then we add ся onto that, and we get смеющийся or учащийся. Note the stress there, right? That again, looking at the ya form is the most reliable way to get the stress right. Now let's imagine if instead of the masculine ending, we had aya here, right? We were modifying a feminine singular, for example, aya. Well, then we would have a final vowel, ya, but we would still write sia, right? So again, that's most definitely an exception to the rule we generally give. So that can be confusing. You might want to make a special note of that. Okay, finally, a few verbs don't follow the general stress pattern. Okay, so again, we'll see this with a lot of these forms. There may be a couple that are just kind of weird and they kind of fall outside of our general method for deriving them. So, for example, besides pishut, the ya would be pishu, but the actual stress is pishushi, right? Pishushi or slujishi, right? Instead of from sluju, right? That would suggest slujashi, but it's slujishi. Okay, so just watch out for that. Again, there are going to be some random exceptions you'll see now and again with these forms. But generally, again, these rules we're giving for deriving these are pretty reliable. Okay, so let's form a few of these. Starting, let's be careful with the ani form. Решать, они решают, решающий, and the translation would be who is solving, right? Танцевать, танцуют, drop the te, танцующий, who is dancing. Number 3, улыбаться, улыбают, улыбаются, right? Улыбают, drop the te, улыбаю, right? Улыбающийся, улыбающийся. Right? Now again, no matter what ending we put on that, what adjectival ending, we're always writing sia. So for example, the feminine, right? I saw a girl who was smiling, was sitting on the bench or whatever. That would be улыбающаяся, улыбающаяся. Number 4, приносить, они приносят. Okay, we've got to worry about the stress. It would be приношу, so приносящий. Приносящий would be the form who is bringing on foot, right? Number 5, стареть, стареют, они стареют, стареющий, who is growing old. Number 6, пить, we get они пьют, пьющий, who is drinking, пьющий. 7, мыть, моют, моющий, who is washing. Начинать, они начинают, начинающий, who is beginning. Number 9, летать, они летают, летающий, who is flying around, right? Again, here's the motion verb, right? Now compare that летающий with лететь, они летят, летящий, right? Who is underway by air, who is underway flying, right? Determinate. Давать. Okay, here we get dayut, and again with these forms, you may have noticed in the table there wasn't an exception for avai verbs. Okay, so for these examples, they're obeying the step-by-step rules we gave, right? So we would get они дают, right? Дающий, who is giving. Курить, курят, курят, but the ya stress would be kuryu, and we get kuryashi, kuryashi, one who smokes, or simply a smoker. Okay, by the way, some of these can stand alone as adjectives. We may see examples of that later, but kuryashi could mean a smoker, right? One who smokes. Okay, let's fill in a few of these examples. And again, we've got to see what adjective is it modifying, and we've got to make it agree in case, number, gender with the noun it's modifying. Он видел девушку blank на него. Okay, so we saw a girl smiling at him. Okay, девушку, note that that's accusative. So, right, feminine, singular accusative. The adjectival ending that would agree with that would be ую, right? Улыбающуюся. Okay, now here we've got to be careful, right? Улыбаться is a reflexive verb, right? We've got to include the ся. So улыбающую, and then despite the fact that ends in a vowel, right, we do add ся, right? Улыбающуюся на него. 14. Мы видели самолеты, okay, flying determinate across the sky. Летящие, right? Because самолеты, plural, right here in the accusative, летящие по небу. 15, the football player scored their deciding goal. Okay, goal, we see masculine, singular, so this is going to be pretty easy. Решающий, right? deciding. Okay, now we see here that these are adjectives, right? So they don't necessarily have to be used in a separate uh, participial clause, right, or whatever. They can just simply be used as adjectives, usually placed in front of the noun they modify, right? The deciding goal, решающий goal. Number 16, this is a course for beginners. Okay, here's another example of one that can be used alone, all by itself as a noun, right? Начинающий, one who begins or who is beginning, or simply a beginner, right? So для here, for beginners, we need genitive plural. Это курс для начинающих. Для начинающих. And don't forget, не буди спящего медведя. Don't wake a sleeping bear, right? Meaning let a sleeping dog lie. Okay, what about past actives? Right, so remember for these we have two. We can form these from either aspect, right? From imperfective or perfective. If we see a quick painting, na linii огня, on the line of fire, right? This is from World War One, right? Первая мировая война. Русские атакуют, right? The Russians are attacking. В середине мы видим солдата, получившего ранение. Он падает, умирая. Right, in the middle of the painting, right, в середине, we see a soldier. Okay, well, what kind of soldier? One who has received a wound, right? A soldier who has received a wound. That's from the perfective verb получить. Получить, right? So a soldier who has received a wound, or who has been wounded, would say in English, I guess. Он падает, умирая. He's falling. How is he falling? Dying, right? He's falling, dying. And here he hasn't quite begun to fall, but we have the idea that he's been hit and he's stopped his forward motion and he's about to fall, dying, we presume. Okay. So let's see. So let's take the pair читать, прочитать, and we see, again, we can get two verbal past active verbal adjectives, right? Читавший, прочитавший. And we can see already that we're going to form these in the exact same way, regardless of aspect, right? The only difference, you see читавший, прочитавший, right? The only difference is the second one has pro, right? It's from the perfective member of the aspectual pair. Okay, so in most cases, again, these are going to be very easy to form. We're going to start with the past tense. We're going to remove the L if there is one, right? And we're going to add she, right? So note we're going to end up with an adjectival ending, of course, right? So we'd get forms like from читал, читавший, прочитал, прочитавший. We could translate these in a number of ways, right? So this isn't completely cut and dried, but who was reading, right? That past continuous is often a good first choice, versus something like who has read or who had read, or again, maybe even who had finished reading, right? Just anything to get across the fact that this is from a perfective verb, right? So it's focused on the completion of an action, the successful completion of a task or whatever. Okay, so for reflexive verbs, we simply add the sia onto it, kind of like we were just doing. Строившийся, right? Again, it would always be sia. Okay, what about some special verbs that don't have L in the past tense? Again, we sort of talked about this already, right? Like nios. Okay, so we don't have an L to drop, right? In that case, we simply add she, right? No ve, simply she. Okay, so you might want to circle this. This is a fairly important kind of exception. We would get forms like niosshi, принесший, ведший, right? Now what about et, right? Et and any prefix forms of et, those are simply irregular in this case. We get from shed, right? We get shedshi, prishedshi, right? So just think of that as just an irregularity. And again, always watch out for these forms of et whenever we're forming deverbals, right? They're almost always a little bit funny. Okay, so look at a couple of examples. Студенты, читавшие «Войну и мир» versus студенты, прочитавшие «Войну и мир». And just remember that the translations we gave there in the table, they're only suggestions, right? These, we would just choose a translation based on whatever we need, we would say in the English to capture the aspectual distinction. So for example, that студенты, читавшие «Войну и мир», that could mean students who were reading, in the sense of they were in the process. But remember that remember our discussion of aspect, this читать verb could simply point to the fact that they've read War and Peace at all, right? Remember that вообще stuff. So it actually could translate as students who have read War and Peace, right? In the sense of, again, they've ever read it at all, вообще, right? So just be on guard for things like that. And again, the key here is to home in on what aspect, right? What aspect are we looking at in Russian, as always, right? And we would translate in whatever way would be appropriate given the context that would allow us to capture the aspectual distinction. Right, so студенты, прочитавшие «Войну и мир», okay, that's from прочитать, so the focus is on completion. So students who have finished reading or who had finished reading maybe would be a good way to make that perfectly clear. Okay, so let's form a few of these and call it a day. Okay, for писать, okay, again, try to start with the past tense form. Писал, drop the L, we get писавший, писавший. Right? Let's just say who was writing. But again, we have to be a little bit careful with these translations. They won't always work. Okay, compare that to написать. Okay, in this exercise, you see we're getting the aspectual pair so that we can compare the two past active adjectives we can get from the pair, right? So instead of писавший, from написать, we get написавший, right? No difference in how we're forming those. And we could say maybe who has finished writing, who has completely written. From пить, we get пил, пивший, right? Maybe who was drinking versus выпивший, who has drunk, right? Who has completely drunk something, who's had a drop to drink, or however you'd like to put it, right? Выпивший. Открываться, okay? Открывался, открывавшийся, открывавшийся versus from открыл, открывшийся, открывшийся, right? Who was being opened or which was being opened versus which has been opened or which had been opened, which was completely opened, right? Any number of ways to capture that difference. Okay, number 7, решать, решал, решавший versus решил, решивший, решавший who was in the process of solving versus решивший who has solved successfully, completely. Number 9, приносить, we would get приносящий, I was jumping back to the active one, sorry. Приносил, that would give us приносивший. Приносивший who was bringing versus принесший. Right now, watch out for that one. We would get past tense принес, right? No L to drop. We simply add she and we get принесший. Right? Who was bringing versus who has brought or who had brought. Okay, from идти, we get simply шедший. That one is just irregular. We have to simply know that one. Who was underway by foot. Приходить, that would give приходящий. Sorry, I'm on the active, the present actives I keep doing. We would go from приходил, приходивший, which would mean who was arriving, versus прийти, okay, again, an irregular et verb, пришедший. We'd get пришедший meaning who has come, right? Who has arrived on foot. Okay, so let's use a few of these in sentences. And again, we've got to watch for agreement, right? What noun are they modifying? And what ending do we need? Okay, a man who had been drinking, right? He'd obviously had something to drink, perfective, right? Approached me. Ко мне подошел мужчина, явно выпивший. Okay, we're modifying there мужчина, which is tricky, right? Remember, it takes feminine endings, but it's masculine, right? So we just need masculine, nominative singular, выпивший. The students who solved the problem got an A, right, or literally a five, a fiver, a пятерка. Студенты, okay, that's masculine nominative plural, right? Also anima, but that doesn't really matter here. Студенты, решившие задачу, okay? Perfective, right? Students who have successfully solved the problem. They got a 5. 16. Мы поговорили с женщиной. Okay, with what kind of woman did we get acquainted? Or did we speak with? Sorry. We spoke with a woman who was writing a novel. Okay, that's imperfective, right? From писать. We get писавший. And here we need feminine instrumental singular, right? Писавший. Писавший. Okay, 17. We welcomed the guests who had arrived. Okay, we welcomed the guests. Okay, that's animate, masculine animate, accusative plural, which looks like genitive, right? So we're going to get an adjectival in here that looks like genitive plural. Мы приветствовали пришедших гостей. Мы приветствовали пришедших гостей. Okay, let's review what we've covered so far and where we're headed, right? We covered yesterday verbal adverbs, of which there are only 2, right? We covered those. Adverbs are out of the way. Today we started with verbal adjectives, right? And today we've covered the active ones, right? So active, we've done present and past, right? That leaves passive, which are also present and past, right? So tomorrow we're going to start with the passive ones. And we'll see that one type of past participle or past verbal adjective, which we'll call PPPs for short, past passive participle, are very common and also rather difficult to form, right? So those are going to be by far the most difficult deverbals we'll have to deal with. And we'll have to take quite a bit to really look at all their forms in detail. But once we get through those, we'll be done with verbal adverbs, verbal adjectives, and we'll just have to look quite quickly at verbal nouns, which are actually quite easy to produce. And then we'll be done with this very important topic of all the different words we can derive from verbs. Okay, anyway, until next time, до свидания.